Sterling Maddox woke to absolute silence. Not the peaceful kind. The kind that comes before death. Outside his cabin window, 100 warriors stood motionless in perfect formation, their faces painted for ceremony. Not war. They had appeared like ghosts in the pre-dawn darkness surrounding his ranch without making a sound. Sterling, quote, "S weathered hands didn't reach for his rifle. He knew better. They weren't here to kill him. They were here for something far more complicated. The old man rose. From his bed, his joints protesting after decades of hard living and harder choices. He, quote, "He'd been expecting this day for 23 years. He just never imagined they would come in such numbers or with such formality." Through the cracked glass, he could see their leader, a woman with silver streaking her black hair, her eyes fixed on his front door. She held something in her hands, something that made Sterling's chest tighten with memories he'd buried deeper than any grave. The morning sun crested the horizon, casting long shadows across the dusty yard. Still comma. Not one warrior moved. Not one horse shifted. It was as if time itself had stopped to witness whatever was about to unfold. Sterling knew what they wanted. The question was whether he could give it to them. Because the last time he tried to help these people, he'd lost everything that mattered. His family, his name, his very soul. But as he watched the silent army of warriors maintaining their vigil, Sterling realized that some debts can never be forgotten. Some honors can never be denied, and some truths are worth dying for. Sterling, quote, "S bare feet touched the cold wooden floor as he moved toward the window. Each step sent pain shooting through his arthritic joints, but he ignored it. Pain was an old companion now. He pressed his weathered face against the glass, studying the formation outside. The warriors had positioned themselves in a perfect circle around his small ranch house. Each man exactly 10 paces from the next. Their horses stood behind them in disciplined rows. Not a single animal pawing the ground or snorting. Even nature seemed to hold its breath. The leader, the woman with silver-streaked hair, remained directly in front of his. Dr. Sterling could see her clearly now. Ayanna. After all these years, she had grown into the strong woman he'd always known she would become. The scared, starving child he'd once carried to safety was gone, replaced by someone who commanded absolute respect. In her hands, she held a bundle wrapped in deerskin. Sterling knew what lay inside that bundle. His throat tightened with emotion he'd thought long dead. A young warrior shifted slightly in the formation, breaking the perfect stillness. Ayanna turned her head just enough to look at him. The movement was subtle, but the message was clear. The young man froze back into position immediately. Sterling pulled on his worn leather boots and buttoned his shirt. With shaking fingers. 2-3 years he'd lived in this isolation, speaking to no one, trusting no one, believing he deserved nothing better than this empty existence. But they had found him anyway. He walked to his kitchen table where his coffee cup sat cold and untouched. Next to it lay the letter he'd been writing and rewriting for months. The one he never planned to send. His confession, his apology, his explanation for choices that had cost him everything. Outside, comma, the sun climbed higher. The warriors maintained their vigil without a single sound. Sterling knew this moment would define everything. That came next. He could stay inside, pretend this wasn't happening, and wait for them to leave. Or he could face the truth he'd been running from since that terrible winter, when everything changed. The bundle in Ayanna's hands caught the morning light. And Sterling saw the faded blue fabric peeking through the deer. Skin wrapping. His daughter's dress, the one she'd been wearing the day she died, the day he'd chosen to save an entire tribe instead of saving her. Sterling, S. Hand trembled as he reached for the door handle, then stopped. The weight of that winter day crashed over him like a collapsing barn. December 1851. The blizzard that lasted 8 days. The choice that destroyed everything he'd ever loved. He remembered Ayanna as she was then, barely 12 years old. Her lips blue with cold, her small body burning with fever. She been the first one he'd found in the snow, nearly dead beside her frozen horse. Behind her, scattered across the frozen valley, lay 47 members of her tribe. Men, women, children, all starving, all dying. Sterling had been traveling home to his wife and daughter. His saddlebags heavy with medical supplies from town. Christmas was 3 days away. He promised little Emma he'd be home in time to help her hang the stockings by the fireplace. Instead, he'd found himself facing an impossible choice. Through the window. He watched Ayanna's steady breathing create small puffs of vapor in the cool morning air. She hadn't moved from her position in 20 minutes. None of them had. This wasn't impatience or aggression. This was ceremony. This was respect being paid. But respect for what? For the man who'd saved their ancestors, or for the man who'd failed his own family in the process? Sterling walked to the wooden chest beside his bed and lifted the lid with hands that shook more from memory than age. Inside, beneath layers of dust and regret, lay the newspaper clipping he'd kept all these years. The headline still made his stomach clench. Local ranchers' family perishes while he aids hostile tribe. Hostile. They called Ayanna's people hostile. The same people who were now standing in perfect formation around his home, their weapons sheathed, their intentions clearly peaceful. The article painted him as a traitor, a man who'd abandoned his Christian duty to his own family. The town had turned against him within days. His neighbors stopped speaking to him. His ranch hands quit. The bank called in his loans. But what the newspaper hadn't known, what nobody had known, was that Sterling hadn't just stumbled upon those dying people. He'd been searching for them, tracking them. Because his daughter Emma wasn't just his daughter. She was half Cheyenne, Ayanna's cousin. And the tribe dying in that valley was Emma's mother's people. Outside, a hawk circled overhead, its cry breaking the morning silence. Several of the warriors looked up, following its path across the sky. But their positions remained unchanged. Sterling closed his eyes and let the full weight of that terrible winter consume him. D made his choice, knowing exactly what it would cost him. Now, after more than 2 decades of exile and shame, Judgment Day had finally arrived. Sterling forced himself to remember those 8 days in detail. Every frozen breath, every life saved, every moment that took him further from home and deeper into a choice he couldn't undo. D found Ayanna first, barely conscious in the snow. Her fever was so high she was delirious, calling for her mother in a language Sterling understood better than most white men. Emma, as Cheyenne mother had taught him the basics before she died, giving birth to their daughter. Behind Ayanna, he discovered the rest of the band. 7 souls scattered across the valley like fallen leaves. Some still breathing, some already gone. The survivors were too weak to travel, too sick to hunt, too proud to beg. Sterling had made camp right there in the open, using his own supplies to build shelters against the relentless wind. His medical knowledge, learned from his father, who'd been a frontier doctor, told him what each person needed. Willow bark, tea for the fevers, hot broths for the malnourished, warm blankets for the children whose lips had turned blue with cold. For 3 days he'd worked without sleep, tending wounds, feeding the weak, keeping fires burning despite the howling blizzard that seemed determined. To bury them all, each life he saved, felt like a small victory against the cruel winter. But on the 4th day, the storm had worsened. The temperature dropped so low that even breathing became painful. Several of the elders were failing despite his efforts. That quote when he'd made the decision that would haunt him forever. He quote de-used the last of his winter coat to wrap a dying child. Given his final blanket to an old woman whose cough was rattling her chest, shared his remaining food with nursing mothers whose milk had dried up from starvation. By the 6th day, Sterling himself was growing weak. His hands were numb with cold. His lips were cracked and bleeding. But he couldn't leave. These people were Emma's blood relatives, her mother's family, the grandmother who'd sung lullabies in Cheyenne, the uncles who'd carved toys from wood, the cousins who'd played with Emma during their secret visits to the reservation. Outside his cabin window, Ayanna shifted slightly. She was no longer the dying child he'd cradled against his chest 23 years ago. Now she stood as the leader of 100 warriors, her presence commanding absolute respect from every man behind her. The bundle in her hands seemed to grow heavier with each passing moment. Sterling knew that inside that deerkin wrapping lay not just Emma's dress, but everything he'd lost. His family, his reputation, his place in the world. But looking at Ayanna now, strong, proud, alive. Sterling wondered if he'd actually lost everything or if he'd simply been too broken to see what he'd gained. The real question was whether he was ready to find out which truth the warriors had come to honor. On the 8th day, the blizzard finally broke. Sterling had managed to save 31 lives. 16 had been lost to the cold and starvation, but those who remained were strong enough to make the journey to the reservation, where food and proper shelter waited. Ayanna had been among the survivors. Weak, but alive. She'd looked up at Sterling with eyes that held a gratitude too deep for words. Her fever had broken on the 5th day. The willow bark tea and constant care had pulled her back from death's door. As the rescued band prepared to leave, the tribal elder had pressed something into Sterling's hands. A small carved medallion depicting a bear protecting its cubs. For the man who chose our children over comfort, the old man had whispered in broken English. This debt will never be forgotten. Sterling had pocketed the medallion and started his journey home, exhausted, but certain he'd made the right choice. Emma would understand. His wife Sarah would be proud. They quote both know why he'd stayed to help their daughter's relatives. But when he'd finally reached his ranch on that clear, cold morning, he'd found only silence. The house was dark. No smoke rose from the chimney. His calls for Emma and Sarah went unanswered. With growing dread, Sterling had pushed open the front door and stepped into a scene that would replay in his nightmares for decades. Sarah lay in their bed, her face peaceful, but her skin cold as marble. The doctor would later say it had been pneumonia brought on by the same brutal cold that had nearly killed the tribe. She quote fought it for days, waiting for Sterling to return with the medicine he'd promised to bring. Back from town. But those medical supplies, the fever-reducing powders, the lung tonics, the blankets, had all been used to save Ayanna's people. Emma had been in the kitchen wrapped in every quilt they owned. Her small body curled near the dying embers of the fire. She quote, tried to tend to her mother alone, tried to keep warm, tried to wait for her father to come home. The blue dress she'd been wearing, the one she'd planned to wear for Christmas morning, was now wrapped in Ayanna's hands outside his door. Sterling had buried his family in the frozen ground behind the house, his heart as cold as the December earth. The town had learned the truth within days, while Sterling Maddox was playing savior. To hostile Indians, his own wife and daughter had died from the very illnesses he could have prevented. Now, 23 years later, Ayanna stood outside his door with that dress, leading a H-100 Red Warriors in what could only be called a ceremony. But Sterling still didn't understand why was this judgment, forgiveness, or something else entirely. The morning sun was climbing higher, and still the warriors maintained their silent vigil. Sterling realized that whatever they wanted from him, they were prepared to wait as long as necessary to receive it. The question was whether he had the courage to give them what they'd come for. Sterling, S hand, finally closed around the door handle. The metal was cold against his palm, but not as cold as the fear that had frozen his heart for 23 years. He pulled the door open and stepped onto his porch. The effect was immediate. Every warrior shifted slightly, their attention focusing on him with laser precision, but there was no hostility in their gaze. No weapons drawn. Just 100 pairs of eyes watching him with something that looked almost like reverence. Ayanna stepped forward, her movements deliberate and ceremonial. She was close enough now that Sterling could see the lines around her eyes, the silver threads in her braided hair, the scars on her hands that spoke of a hard life well-lived. But her posture radiated strength and authority. "Sterling Maddox," she said, her voice carrying clearly across the silent yard. Her English was perfect, with only the slightest accent coloring her words. The man who gave everything. Sterling's throat was dry as dust. "Ayanna, you grew up strong." A slight smile touched her lips because you made sure I lived long enough to grow up. Behind her, the warriors remained motionless. But Sterling could feel their attention like heat from a fire. This wasn't a casual visit. This was something that had been planned, prepared for, perhaps rehearsed. "Why now?" Sterling asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "After all these years, why come now?" Ayanna raised the bundle in her hands, and Sterling could see more clearly now what lay within the deerskin, wrapping not just Emma's dress, but other things, small items, precious things. Because Ayanna said slowly, "Yesterday I buried my father, the elder who gave you this." She reached into her shirt and pulled out an identical carved medallion, a bear protecting its cubs. With his dying breath, he made me promise that the debt would be honored, that the story would be told, that the truth would be spoken. Sterling felt his knees grow weak. The old elder was dead. The man who'd witnessed Sterling's sacrifice, who'd known the real story, who'd understood the impossible choice between love and love. Before he died, Ayanna continued, "He told me something I never knew about the night you found us in the snow, about what you whispered to him when you thought I was too sick to hear." Sterling's memory raced back to that terrible week. What had he said? What confession had slipped from his lips during those delirious days of fighting death and cold? "You told him?" Ayanna's voice grew softer. That you weren't just saving strangers. You were saving your daughter's family. That Emma's mother had made you promise before she died in childbirth. That if her people ever needed help, you would be there for them. The words hit Sterling like a physical blow. He had forgotten saying that, forgotten making that promise to his beloved wife's sister. As she lay dying, forgotten everything except the guilt and loss that had consumed him. "You kept a promise to a dead woman," Ayanna said. "And it cost you everything you had left to give." Tears Sterling hadn't shed in decades. Burned his eyes. The promise? He'd forgotten about the promise made to Little Dove as she lay dying, her hand pressed to his, her eyes pleading with him to watch over her people if they ever faced the kind of winter that could destroy them. "The elder told me more," Ayana continued, her voice steady but gentle. He said that in those 8 days, you never complained, never spoke of your own family waiting at home, never mentioned that you were supposed to return with medicine. You just gave everything you had. Sterling looked down at his weathered hands. I failed them anyway. Sarah and Emma died because I wasn't there. No. The word came from behind Ayana, spoken by one of the younger warriors. He stepped forward slightly, his face earnest. You saved 31 lives that winter. 3. One people who lived to have children, grandchildren. My grandmother was one of them. My mother, my infant sister. More voices joined in. My father, my uncle, my wife's grandfather. Sterling realized that every warrior standing in his yard was connected to someone he'd saved that winter. This wasn't just a ceremony. This was a gathering of bloodlines, a reunion of the descendants of the 3-1. Ayana unwrapped the bundle completely now, revealing not just Emma's blue dress, but a collection of items that took Sterling's breath away. His old medical bag, the one he'd left behind in his exhaustion. Piece of the blanket he'd used to wrap the dying child. The carved wooden cup he'd used to give water to the fevered. We kept them, Ayana explained. All these years we kept every piece of you that remained in our camp because the elder said someday we would need to return them. Someday we would need to complete the circle. Complete the circle? Sterling's voice was hoarse sorrow. You gave us life, said the young warrior who'd spoken before. You gave us future. You gave us the chance to become who we are today. But in doing so, you lost your own future. You quote, "We lived in exile, in shame, carrying guilt that was never yours to bear." Another warrior, an older man with gray streaking his temples, stepped forward. The town called you traitor. They said you chose Indians over your own people. They were wrong. You chose love over convenience, Ayana said firmly. You chose honor over safety. You chose to keep a sacred promise even when it cost you everything. Sterling looked around at the 100 faces surrounding him, young and old, men and women, all watching him with expressions of deep respect. These weren't the hostile savages the newspapers had described. These were families, people who'd built lives, raised children, created communities, all because he'd chosen to stay. In that frozen valley 23 years ago. The elders' final words, Ayana said, holding up Emma's dress, were that a man who saves children should not die forgotten and alone. That a man who keeps sacred promises deserves to know his sacrifice meant something. The morning sun climbed higher, casting Sterling's shadow long across the dusty ground. 4. The first time in over 2 decades, he felt something other than guilt and regret. He felt the possibility that maybe, just maybe, he hadn't failed everyone after all. Ayana stepped closer to Sterling. Emma, quote, S blue dress held reverently in her hands. This belonged to your daughter. We quote, we cared for it as we would care for the memory of our own children. Sterling, quote, S voice caught in his throat. How did you? The elder found it in the snow beside your house the day after you buried them. Ayana said gently. He said the wind had blown it from their burial clothes. He kept it, knowing that someday it would need to be returned to you properly. She extended the dress toward him. But Sterling couldn't bring himself to take it. Not yet. There, quote, S something else. Ayana continued. Something. The elder made me promise to tell you about what happened after we reached the reservation that winter. Sterling waited, his heart pounding. Within a week of our arrival, 3 other bands came to us. They, quote, heard what you did. How a white man had risked everything to save Indians he'd never met. Word spread across every reservation from here to the mountains. Another warrior stepped forward, an older woman with kind, eyes and calloused hands. My brother was dying of the same fever in a camp 2 days' ride north. When our medicine man heard your story, he traveled to you. But you were already gone, driven out by the town. He tracked you for months, Ayana added. Many of us did. We wanted to help you to repay what you'd given us, but you disappeared completely. Sterling remembered those early months after losing his family. The way he'd moved from place to place, never staying long enough to form connections, never trusting anyone enough to tell his story. 2-3 years. The older woman said. 2-3 years. We've searched for Sterling Maddox. The man who chose love over hatred. The man who proved that some white men still remember what honor means. Suddenly, Ayana raised her hand high above her head. It was a signal. As one, every warrior in the circle raised their right hand toward the sky. The movement was sharp, precise, unmistakably ceremonial. They held the position for a long moment, their faces solemn, their eyes fixed on Sterling. Then, in perfect unison, they brought their hands to their hearts. The silence that followed was profound, not empty, but full of respect, gratitude, and recognition. Sterling felt the weight of 100 hearts acknowledging his sacrifice, his loss, his choice to put others before himself. But the ceremony wasn't over. Ayana nodded toward the horizon, where Sterling could now see dust clouds approaching. Riders, dozens of them coming from multiple directions. We sent word, she explained, to every settlement within 50 miles, to every ranch, every trading post, every town that would listen. We told them the truth about Sterling Maddox, about what really happened that winter. Sterling, eyes widened as he recognized some of the approaching riders. Men from town, ranchers from neighboring spreads, people who'd shunned him, who'd called him traitor, who'd driven him into exile. They, coming to witness the truth. Ayana said firmly, To see a man receive the honor he should have been given 23 years ago. The riders arrived in groups, their horses kicking up clouds of dust that painted the morning air. Sterling recognized faces he hadn't seen in decades. Mayor, Chris from town, Tom Morrison, who'd run the general store, ranch hands who'd once worked his land before abandoning him. They reined in their horses at a respectful distance, forming a wide outer circle around the warriors. Sterling could see confusion, curiosity, and something that might have been shame flickering across their weathered faces. Ayana's voice carried clearly across the assembled crowd. 2-3 years ago, this man made a choice. The newspapers called it betrayal. The town called it weakness. They were wrong. She lifted Emma's blue dress higher, and the morning sunlight caught the faded fabric. Sterling Maddox kept a sacred promise to his dying wife. He saved 31 lives in the worst blizzard this territory had ever seen. He gave his medicine, his food, his warmth, his hope. And when he returned home, he found that his sacrifice had cost him everything. A murmur ran through the crowd of townspeople. Sterling could see recognition dawning on several faces, understanding that the story they'd believed for over 2 decades might not have been the whole truth. But from those 31 lives, Ayana continued, came children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren. Every person standing in this circle today owes their existence to Sterling Maddox. The young warrior who'd spoken earlier stepped forward. My grandmother lived to see me born because of this. Man. My children will grow up knowing his name. A's will mine, said another. And mine. The declarations rippled through the circle of warriors. Each voice adding weight to the truth that had been buried under decades of misunderstanding. Sterling finally stepped forward and took Emma's dress from Ayana's hands. The fabric was soft despite its age. Carefully preserved. He pressed it. against his chest, and felt for the first time in 23 years that his daughter would be proud of the choice he'd made. "The debt is honored," Ayanna said formally, her words carrying the weight of ceremony. "The circle is complete. Sterling Maddox, you are no longer alone." Mayor Hicks urged his horse a few steps closer, his face flushed with embarrassment. "Maddox? We the town. We never knew the whole story. You never asked," Sterling replied quietly, but without bitterness. "You just believed what was easiest to believe." Tom Morrison removed his hat, his voice gruff. "What can we do? How do we make this right?" Sterling looked around at the 100 warriors who'd traveled from across the territory to honor him. At the townspeople who'd ridden out to witness the truth, at the endless sky stretching above them all. "You can remember," he said simply. "Remember that sometimes the right choice is the hardest choice. Remember that honor doesn't always look like what you expect." Ayanna nodded respectfully. "Our work here is done, but the story will be told in every camp around every fire for generations to come. Children will learn the name Sterling Maddox. As the warriors mounted their horses and began to disperse, Sterling felt something he hadn't experienced in over 2 decades. Peace. Not the absence of pain, but the presence of purpose. His sacrifice had meaning. His choice had been right. The frontier would indeed remember this day, not as the morning 100 warriors surrounded a lonely ranch, but as the day a forgotten hero was finally welcomed home. If you enjoyed this story, click the video on your screen now to watch another unforgettable tale where honor and sacrifice collide in ways you never expected. Forget to subscribe and consider a super chat to help us keep bringing you more stories like these. Your support means everything to us.